Hello, in this screencast we're going to go through the process of creating a custom trend panel. In this case we're going to do alpha delta ratios by region, and we're going to use a batch file to process a micrometadata recording. It could be with any file format as we look at the structure of the batch file for the Persyst command line interface. And then we're going to look at the output of that file. My name is Michael Guest, VP of Research and Clinical Applications for Persyst. Let's go ahead and get started. First operation is to create the custom trend panel for that, and so to do that I'm just going to launch Persyst. This is running Persyst version 14, revision D1, and so if you're running a version that's earlier than that, there may be subtle differences in the feature set of the Persyst command line interface, but the process of creating the trends and batch processing is largely the same. So let's go ahead and open that recording. Rather than the database, I'm going to browse the file system in this case, just because I have the recording on the C drive in this folder. It's a local folder to the hard drive, and that's where I'm setting up my batch file to work from. One, because it's quicker to run from the local hard drive, and two, just as you're beginning to set up a batch file, it's easier to do it with as few variables as possible, and then expand from there if you need to be processing from a network file store and a UNC path, etc. All right. First step will be to modify the trend template, because I'm going to use one and give it a different name. I'm basing it on the default trend setup, and so I'm going to pick trend settings version p14.mmx, and this will launch an editing window in Persyst. Well, running Persyst, and it'll say modified template mode in the upper corner there. So it's the second instance of Persyst used for editing the trend template. Let's go ahead and say, rather than copying a trend and then giving it a new name and modifying it, or trend panel, I'm going to create a new panel. But again, you have the option to duplicate a panel or add a panel. I'm just going to add one, and I'm going to call this ADR CSV, because I'm going to use this to export CSV values. Click OK. I've got a blank trend. I'm going to click Add. And the only time you use new trend is if you don't have a trend of that type already in the list that you can replicate. So if I were to click new trend, you get a whole list of trend types that you can add here. I'm going to click cancel there, because I've already got alpha delta ratio trends. And let me cancel this again just to show a difference here. We have alpha delta ratios here, and these are running a time trend, and so they're averaged over 2 minutes, which is typical for clinical applications. But we'll go ahead and look at one other one. We've got power by frequency band, and again, these are 2-minute running averages as well. But for CSV export, if you want the output by FFT epoch, then that's why we're going to use a new panel. So I'm going to go back to this panel, and I'm going to select Add, and I'm going to scroll down here to my power ratios, and I've got by quadrant and by hemisphere. I'm just going to grab all these and select OK. And then to reorder these, let's say I want left hemisphere at the top, I can drag and drop by clicking on the control bar, but you can also go into the trend preferences and move them up and down. So I'm doing left over right as this is the convention here, but you may want to do left over right, or right over left rather. You can do it either way. Obviously you can order them in any position you want. So I've got left and right hemisphere, left and right anterior, left and right posterior. Now if I wanted to add single channels, I could right click, replicate trend, and I could add individual channels. Why don't we do some of those? So we'll do C3P3 and C4P4 as additional individual channels, and without having to recreate the trend by scratch, it just replicates those. And if I click on this, I can see the parameters for this. Power ratio, it's 8:13 over 1:4. You can modify these parameters. Now in the research package, you can get to the engine parameters themselves. So if I go into trend preferences here, and this is just for an example, you'll have an option to look at calculation engines, and I could pick the FFT engine and edit that, and we can see the epoch duration is 8 seconds. So instead of using the 2-minute time trends to average values, over 2 minutes or any value that you wanted. I'm going to get the native epoch duration there. Now that's what shows up in the research package, is the ability to get to the calculation engines. All right, if I'm happy with this, I'm going to go ahead and save this as a new trend template. And I'm going to do save as. You can name it here or you can browse. Let's go ahead and browse the location, and I'm going to call this trend P14 ADRs and CSV, because we want to make a new trend panel for that and save. Now the other thing, by saving this with this displayed, it makes it the default trend panel. And so when I'm creating the CSV export, whatever the default trend panel is what gets exported. If I had displayed, for instance, the versus baseline comprehensive trend panel and save that as the default, when I get a CSV export through the Persyst command line interface, it'll export all the values for all the trends, which include several spectrograms. So it would show power by frequency bin, and you get a whole lot of columns. In this case, since we're just doing alpha delta ratios, we'll get single values, and they'll be ordered by left and right hemisphere, and then left and right, anterior, posterior, and then these two channels. So we'll end up with this number of trends, and it'll be incremented by 8 seconds per row, as we'll see here shortly. So I've got this new trend panel. Now the other thing you can do is you can set fixed initial panel, not necessary because we've already done that by saving this with this display, but I can force that as well by doing this. So we'll do that as belt and suspenders, as they say. And so I can process this to see how I like the output. Okay, that looks like it's working nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the trends and close this editing window and save my changes. Sure, I'm going to save that. Now this is the original window that was open. So if I go to Preferences and Trend Preferences here, what it's set to use hasn't changed. It's just been sitting there while I've been doing the editing. It still says Trend Settings version P14 MMX. That's what it's going to process with. So let's go ahead and process it once with this new trend panel. In this instance, I don't have to process the whole recording. I can just process a little bit of it. And so we'll let that get going. Okay, we've got a little bit of trend forming here. And notice in the upper right with this version, it says it's calibrating the spike detection and the seizure detections, because those are still running. It's just running with its displays in a different panel. So if I go to the versus baseline comprehensive, we'll see those values starting to show up there, or those trends. So there's the seizure probability, spikes for 10 seconds, and so forth. So let me go ahead and set it back to our CSV. And by closing this, you can pause it if you want, then it will set that as the default trend type. So what I'm going to do, you can do it either way. You can delete all the results. This is a single file format, just the TRC. I can delete these results, or I could open it up and clear the trends. Either way. So I'm going to clear the trends because now I want to try the batch processing for this. And if you wanted to make double sure that everything was loading with the defaults you wanted, I could delete those last two Persyst format files, just leave this. And when I open this recording in Persyst, it should automatically load that trend template MMX and set the default trend panel correctly. So I'm going to set this to show the file format, and it's showing up with obviously the correct trend template because we have this ADR CSV panel, and it sets this as the default panel. So all that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Now for the batch file, I'm going to go ahead and go up a folder. These are just ad hoc folders I created for this purpose. And we're going to edit this batch file just to show you what's in it. And so here we have the full path to the PSCLI program. You don't have to have that if you're running it from the Persyst program folder, which is listed here. The process switch, export CSV, and I give it a file type. So if this was a different file format, for instance, I could type in Excel text and change the file format to extension to EEG, and I could use this with Excel text files. So modifying this is pretty easy, and again, I can change the location of the file. If I'm scanning in a different location, that's all fine. I'm not going to save that. I'll just open it again. Show this is the format of this. And if you were to run this with the PSCLI with a / question mark, it'll give you a full list of all the switches and some examples of their use. Without further ado, let's click the process.bat, and you'll see the command line window open and some text indicating what it's doing. It's going to go ahead and begin processing that file. And if I look over here in this folder where the recording is, I can see those results files already beginning to populate. So let's go ahead and I'll just pause this for a moment, and we'll jump back on the recording as soon as it's done, so you don't have to watch a black screen there in the command line window. This will just take a few minutes to process. Okay, our processing is done. We see press any key to continue. And so we'll go ahead and close this, and the any key, there's an old joke about that. I won't make any funny comments about that, but we'll just close this window because we're done processing. Now if we look here, we see that in this version, Persyst 14 Rev D1, it'll put the CSV file in the folder from where we ran the batch. So in this case, since I ran it from the parent folder, we've got the file name clip.csv. We'll look at that in a moment. If I open up the folder here and scroll down to the Persyst layout file, I can just double click on it, open the recording, and we can see that it completed processing. And there's 8 trends here, but we also have this one which shows the comment and the time. Those won't get populated in the CSV. This is just marking a baseline here for the versus baseline trends, and those are populated here with this. So let's just go back to our CSV trend. And speaking of versus baseline, you can set a baseline in a recording, and you can export trends that have the normalized z-scores from that using an empirical null. This is a n value, so it's versus baseline n value, which is the third dimension there. It's a 3D trend where you've got x, y, and z axes. Increasingly red is higher z-scores, increasingly green is lower z-scores. And the idea of this is that with an empirical null, you can use the patient as their own baseline and look at statistical changes there, which can work where you don't have an expectation of what the change will be, but you want to know if there is a change. Now those versus baseline trends can also be applied to something like a line trend for alpha delta ratios, and then in that case it would just be the versus baseline trend without the n in the middle, because these are two-dimensional trends and we can calculate those as well. So that's just an aside, but let's go ahead and see what we got for our trends. And to do that, if we go back to the folder here and we'll go to the folder where we did the processing from, here's that EEG 488 clip.csv file name, and I don't have Excel running in that virtual machine, but I'll go ahead and bring Excel up, and here's the output. So it lists the file name and other information depending on how things are spaced. But here we have 1 through 8. You can see 9 and 10 here are not populated. They're just zeros. Now these zeros have to do with where the artifact reduction zeroed out the trend value. So these are calculated with artifact reduction. And each one of these is a microvolt value, or I'm sorry, it's not a microvolt value, it's the ratio at that point. So here we're going 8, 9 seconds. So here we have the number of seconds into the record. So that's the time list here with the lapse times. And over on the far left, we have the Microsoft OLE time, but the regular time here may be more useful. So that's exported there. And if we go back to the original window, well, any other questions, let me know. But in a nutshell, the main thing with that CSV output is the format of it. Each iteration will have to do with the type of trend that you're exporting and the population of that trend display. And that varies by the trend type, as you would expect. So again, my name is Michael Guest, VP of Research and Clinical Applications for Persyst. Feel free to contact me if there's any questions. Thanks.